All right. Shall we kick it off?
Hi there, Chris. Yeah, should we kick it off?
Yeah, I think it's exactly 3 p.m., right?
It does look to be 3 p.m.
Let's kick it off.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, we will be giving you the latest updates on how to get donor mapping right. I'm Juliet. I'm the Digital Marketing Specialist at MZN, and I would like to start off by introducing our speaker, Chris, our Managing Director at MZN.
Hey. Thanks, Jules. Shall I just dive right in? Because it's a pretty straightforward topic today.
Sure.
Okay, easy peasy. Let's kick it right off. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. I didn't let you do the thing about Q&A, so I'll take over here. Usually for these webinars, we get a lot of questions. Please help my colleague Jules and me by putting the questions into the Q&A function. That would be much appreciated. Closed caption is provided to provide full access, and this session will be recorded and the slides will be shared with you by my wonderful colleagues either tonight or tomorrow. What do you think, Jules?
Hopefully by tomorrow morning.
Wonderful. So you can follow this webinar without having to frantically screen copy if you want to do so. Good, let's kick it right off. My name is Chris. Many of you will know MZN. If you don't, I'll keep it very brief. MZN is a social enterprise for nonprofits, and our mission is to build better, stronger, better funded NGOs in an attempt to contribute to making a better world. So we help them, amongst others, to be better funded, better managed, better organized, with better strategies. That's the grand mission. And as part of that mission is funding, as I've just mentioned. And funding pretty much depends on donors and fundraising, as well as income generation. Today, Jules and I are looking at the donor part of it, in particular, the basics of it and how to prepare a donor map. So what my attempt here is this week to give a very brief overview about the basics of NGO funding to provide some background, then very practical information about why we do a donor map and how to do it, and then how to use it. So this is more of a pragmatic, detailed-orientated webinar. Experience teaches us that I should spend no more than 20 minutes, half an hour talking, and then we get to all your questions with a view to finish at about 10 to 4, so in about 45 to 50 minutes. Is that about right, Jules, or did I forget anything?
No, you've got everything covered. Thank you so much.
Good, excellent. So let's kick it right off and talk about a few things about the background about how NGOs really fund themselves. So there are sort of 10 practical steps that are common in any income stabilization or sustainable income strategy for an NGO. And of course, for every NGO, for every organization, the pronunciation of each step might be different. There might be additional or fewer steps, but these 10 over the last 15 years tend to be the common red thread about whenever we work with an NGO to build a stable income stream. And they are basically, yes, about diversification of funding revenue streams through a funding strategy. You'd be surprised how many NGOs we still come across which basically take the money that they can get without having an underlying strategy. And then they're surprised that there's not enough unrestricted, not enough or surplus or overhead covering NGO funding, and only ever enough project funding. So a funding strategy that is adhered to can help diversify funding properly. Obviously, every organization should set its minimum reserve level. Even if it's not at this minimum reserve, then it should strive and build a funding strategy to get to that minimum reserve. And from the other webinars, or if you're already an MZN partner organization, you might know that this is very much something we take into account when we work with our partners in order to get to the reserve level that is realistic. And again, that differs whether you're humanitarian, an advocacy, development, or a cultural or whatever other NGO. But that is getting to the right reserve level and have that as part of the strategy absolutely essential. We want to define a minimum management fee to be recovered or a gross margin, is a technical term. So that means we need to reject some funding opportunities. That's a difficult choice to make, particularly if funding seems scarce. Absolutely essential. Happy to talk about it if you've got any questions. As I said, set those parameters as part of your strategy and stick to it religiously. Going and continuously making exemptions and accepting funding or seeking funding that doesn't get to your required funding streams just isn't helpful. It's just going to erode your NGO, or it might even engage you in this race to the bottom. What I mean here is this race where all the costs that you're ever going to get funded by your donors are direct costs, and somehow there's an inherent assumption that all the learning, all the management, all the progression, all the development, all your knowledge comes free of charge. That is not sustainable, unfortunately. More pragmatically, what we're talking about today is we need to have a system to find and to assess funding opportunities. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Then we'll match those opportunities with the funding streams we choose to our mission and not the other way around. So again, happy to talk about it in Q&A. There's a lot in that sentence, but when we know what we do and what funding we require, we should match that to the mission and not take the funding we can get and match the mission to it. We don't want to be donor-led here. Obviously, there is a requirement to participate flexibly on contracts, whether sometimes you're the lead, sometimes you're a sub, sometimes you're just an associate. All options of these can add value. We've done an analysis in 2022, last year that is, yes, in 2022, where NGOs that had a stably increasing income stream also switched quite a lot between lead and sub positions on a grant or on a commercial contracts. And that was one of the features that really highlighted. You definitely want to work on partnerships. And number 9, I want to talk about, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor actually, can you, Ellie? Is that visible?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, cool. Number 9, we've seen over and over again how surge capacity to the proposal writing team is absolutely essential because unfortunately or fortunately, these proposals never come at a convenient time. They always come in peaks and troughs. So it would be a shame to miss out on an opportunity just because we don't have the capacity to write a proposal. And then last but not least, we need to foster an understanding with our colleagues that income or business development, whatever you want to call it, is a key part of everybody's job, not just something we do ad hoc occasionally. That means every country director, every program officer, regardless where they are based, every partner organization that you regularly work with is regularly designing programs, running budgets, analyzing past projects, and doing something around the business development process. It doesn't mean that head offices or anybody should just completely outsource the business development and grant finding process to everybody else. We've seen that as well. That doesn't work. There needs to be a system in which to work, but ultimately a lot more people need to engage in, including those who currently are funded 100% by an ongoing project. So that's a bit of a culture thing. Again, happy to take questions on it because in each of these things is it's a long conversation in itself. Let's get a little bit more pragmatic and have a quick look of whether we actually invest enough. Many NGOs we work with who come to us and say, look, we don't really have a sustainable income stream. They also, the diagnosis sometimes reveals very quickly, well, you just don't invest enough. So we went around earlier this year and asked just over 50 NGO partners, how much do you invest? Former partners and current partners. And we only asked those NGOs who achieve a continuously high income growth over the last 4 years. So that includes the Corona phase. And we found, it's a big range, but we found that those who achieve continuously high income growth, not just continuous high income, but actually income's addition in double digits figures, spend between 40 and 60 hours per month per countries on donor mapping and opportunity engagement identification. Just let that sink in for a second. 40 to 60 hours per month, that's more than a full-time equivalent for a week, or it's 1.5 weeks technically, or nearly 2 weeks of work per country, per month, just on mapping and identifying opportunities, not bid writing or program design. And there is a simple conclusion here. If you look more for funding, you find more funding. If you treat it as an auxiliary job, something to be done on Friday afternoon or just before we hit the weekend, and then we'll say, well, there isn't enough grant funding out there, then that's probably, and we're not investing this time, that's probably not true. So those 40 to 60 hours, that's a big range. We found for humanitarian organizations, it tends to be a little less. For advocacy, it tends to be a little more. And we did ask a limited sample here of just over 50 NGO partners earlier this year. So there is some flex in those figures. But I think the trend here is clear. We need to ask ourselves if we invest enough time. And of course, one can outsource that, but one way or the other, one needs to get to that or that about level per country per month. Good. I hope that triggers something or that makes you think. If you like to talk a bit more after this webinar, then please do submit a question, the Q&A on that. Let's have a look at donor mapping as we promised. So why do we do it? Well, it's very simple. The donor landscape is disrupted, is changing continuously. The UK is going down, the EU is staying slightly up, Germany is rising rapidly, the US is nominally rising rapidly. You may have seen this in last month's donor update that my colleague Jules also put on. Thank you very much, Jules, for that. So there's a lot of change in the donor landscape, and you can keep updated by joining Jules's donor updates every quarter. Is that right? Every 3 months, Jules?
Yeah, every quarter they're going, we have a webinar on that.
Good, wonderful. So that helps. But analyzing the landscape in between those is absolutely essential. There is obviously a realization that reliance on traditional institutional donors is just not viable because they never pay enough overheads. Again, a bit different for the humanitarian organizations under, for example, of Central European donors, where 50% is unrestricted, that can work. Others don't. Traditional donors, they change their policies rapidly. Many are reducing grants. There's continuously new donors and new countries entering this aid space, which is providing some, massive disruption. There's new foundations, private philanthropists, and a lot of corporate finance and fintech providers moving into this area on almost a weekly level, which is good news. And then the bad news is there's also a lot more competition. So the donor landscape takes all that and maps out for your organization where we sit and what do we do. And there is a clear reason why we do it. A good donor map doesn't just give you that intel on the outside, but and this is really important, it aligns your vision and your mission inside with the opportunities and the funding on the outside. So it's not about just finding and identifying funding opportunities. That, frankly, a simple database can do, or something you can subscribe to. But it is about the alignment between your mission, what you do, and your vision with those opportunities and funding opportunities that makes a good donor map good. So it aggregates this information and gives you a clear understanding of these 4 things. I'm not going to read it out. You get the slides anyway. But basically, it gives you a good donor map, gives you a rating of high, medium, low priorities as per relevant parameters that matter to you. And that's going to be different for every organization. Just a few parameters you might want to think about is how much flexibility do you need in each grant or commercial contract? How much overhead rate do you need? If you have an overhead cost of 13, 15, 20%, and this donor gives you 7, then that is not something you can permanently or do for the long term. Sorry. One other parameter might be the fact that there's a political alignment, particularly if you work in the gender space or the legal advocacy space or in the human rights space. You might not want to align with certain governments or certain foundations. Other priorities are more pragmatic. If the donor has absolutely unrealistic reporting requirements, then again, the funding might be there, but your systems to actually keep it and not make them eligible is not, so we cannot go with that. So a good donor mapping aggregates all this information, aligns it with your requirements, your vision and your mission, and then prioritizes from high, medium, low. It's a great asset to have. So it basically is a difference between continuously trying to race for the next funding and actually strategically, sustainably funding what you do. And the donor map is one of the 3 key documents here that you probably need in order to set that in motion. The other one being your funding strategy and ultimately your sort of signature package or your templates to quickly produce bids. So how do we do it? Finally, we get to that. First of all, you want to build a template. I'll show you a template here in a second. It should be a live, accessible, and interactive document, obviously, or ideally cloud-based on a platform for multiple access. You don't want to email around a template. It can be a simple table. I'll show you one in a second. Most importantly, the donor map should be set up so that it reflects and understands your parameters. I've just set a few of those. I've just given you a few of those, but the criteria and the eligibility standards that you have. Nothing is worse, or very few things are worse, than identifying an opportunity, diving into it, and hours later finding out that you're not eligible. If that happens surprisingly a lot, a good donor map shouldn't even have that opportunity on there. So it's pretty specific to ensure that there's no demotivational, no costly waste of time. It then sets out which donors to research. Again, that avoids disappointment because you're only investigating those that are actually matching your requirements. And you come out with a prospect table or a list of hot opportunities or whatever you want to call it. It's basically a summarized statement of all the opportunities that match that you would like to pursue, and then you can go about prioritizing them. Maybe you're not able to do all of them, maybe you don't want to do all of them, but the top 10, for example. So it's a pretty simple and logical process. And I'll show you a couple of templates around, but before I do, just one last warning. Nope, that's wrong. There we go. It's really, really important to understand who and what it is you are mapping here. So doing a donor map without a clear funding strategy that determines your sort of funding ambition, to what degree of funding do you actually need, is very hard because it will lead you to mapping all opportunities that are out there and that you could get. And that ultimately leads you to being donor-led. So a good donor map should identify which donors can help you fulfill your ambitions, your mission needs, the need that your beneficiaries have, and not map out the donors that are principally available. It might seem like a subtle difference, but it's a really essential one, because if you're doing it the other way around, then yes, you might end up with low funding, but potentially the wrong one. And you will just happily fund and grow your NGO past the actual needs of your mission or your beneficiaries. And that won't generate impact from the get-go. So it's not just a business development or a finance person a task. It is really a C-suite or a leadership level task to make sure that the funding map identifies only the funding which we need and can have. Once that important step is made, keep it simple. I'll make sure that the funding is simple, easy to read, that nobody needs to read a huge guide, that the parameters are clear, and that they're coherently approached. And I'll show you a couple of ways right now to build a template. Every template for every organization is going to be different. So you need to ask yourself a few really key questions when building that template. And here I'm showing you a few. Let me read out a couple to give you an idea what I'm talking about. As I said, Jules will email you the slides tomorrow, and then you'll have the whole list. And you can also contact us if you need additional questions. For example, one of the key questions is, what's your split between unrestricted and restricted funding? If your overhead costs are 30% because you're in an overhead heavy area, then it's probably no good targeting the EU, which on average pays 7% of unrestricted. However, if your unrestricted funding need is not so high, you can get more donors, although you might want to specialize on those that have a fairly low cost of acquiring. So going for the USAID might sound very appealing because you might have a large unrestricted rate according to your NICRA, but the process of getting into it is going to be very expensive. So you might want to focus on the Nordic donors instead, which have a lower and smaller lead time. The other area is sort of innovation. You know, if you are on the cutting edge of doing something new and risky, then there are donors out there who are desperately looking for innovation. They are paying 100% unrestricted for good, innovative ideas, but you need to find them and approach them correctly. Other areas would be the geographical areas, of course, where you look for funding, from where you look for funding, and what type of donor you're looking for. You're looking for one who has an eye on every expense, provides a high level of direct funding, and assists you in the program implementation even. There are donors like that. You know, look at the GIZ, for example, very involved in the execution of the programs here in Germany. Or are you looking more at a donor who sort of gives you the money and then says, send me a report in 1 year time? Both is possible, but we need to make sure that our template reflects those parameters. Yeah, good. Eventually, you will build a template, and then you need to go out and look for funding opportunities. And here I've just listed a few databases that you can regularly use. Some of them are without registrations. You can, of course, go directly to the agency's websites. You can go for the major news items and just a few tools to then populate your template in which you do this. It's pretty labor-intensive work. As I said, you know, sort of 30 to 40 to 60 hours per month per country that you want to look at, but it is the basis for good business development. And then you finally get started and you put it all in a prospect document. As I said, you want to keep it digital. You want it to be prioritized for the most, according to those terms we've just discussed, mixing active calls with potential long-term value calls, with calls that are just not open. They maybe come from the USAID forecast, or they may come from the thematic working groups in the EU or Germany or the UK. And you know some funding is getting there, but they're not sure which one. You might want to allocate every individual opportunity to a team member as a opportunity lead to build that relationship and monitor the funding opportunity. That way you can split the responsibility. And then you can use that prospect table for long-term strategic networking as well as immediate opportunities. So you can see again how the donor map is doing much more than just identifying opportunities. It really is the basis of your business development activity. I'll show you finally a few examples. Here are two that we've built some time ago. I hope you can see this. This is a simple, prospect sheet with the foundations here at the left-hand side, some contacts, a defined stage and date, as well as a column for next steps and focus, and then the contact details, as well as potentially the funding here. We can also go into the grant applications themselves. If you go to the left here and see what have we done. So over time, you build this wonderful database of saying, what have been successful, what application is in process, what's the application type, what has been unsuccessful, what are the actions from this year to next year. So it's after a year or two, you have a wonderful track record, which you can use to target your time and energy for business development ever more better. That usually increases the success rate quite considerably. Another even simpler table, just in case you can't see that just yet, is something like this. This will do. It is really simple, as you can see. It is basically just the name of the donor, the deadline, what you need to do, a status, what your next step is, and the contact details, or maybe a description of the purpose. It doesn't need to be complicated. In fact, simplicity is absolutely key here. Good. So hopefully that helps. Let's have a quick look at the experience and the pitfalls we've had. Number one, you need to invest time and human resource, energy, and motivation at least 3 to 4 hours a week. I would push that for some areas about 7 to 10 hours a week. Absolutely essential in order to make this table worthwhile. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it very accessible. If anybody opens your prospect table or your donor map and cannot see what's it about, then it's probably too complex. So it needs to be a practical tool that is very intuitive to use and easy to understand. You want to share with a larger team, but give very few people admin access. What I mean with admin access is the ability to change the format. We've seen this over and over again, but if you have it completely edible, then within half a year it's going to be a mess. That's going to be impossible to clear up. So here, set the process, lock the sheet, and then share it with everybody. You might want to have a bookmark folder with all the regular opportunities and websites in there. That's really useful. I know it's like a really basic, pragmatic tool, but try to finding a specific funding opportunity on the EU website, for example, or the GIZ website, or even the USAID is quite difficult. So bookmarking and linking it to your prospect table is an easy tool to directly access the website you're looking for. Also, a good pragmatic tool is to put the title of a prospective grant that isn't just out yet into a Google alert. In case, I'm assuming here that everybody knows what a Google alert is. Jules, is that common knowledge or not so much?
It should be, but maybe we should send out a little note on how to do that. I can add that into our post-webinar email.
Super. So Jules knows everything about digital. So Jules will share with you how to put up a Google alert that will actively email you when that word match is coming up. It's a great way to trigger an update to your prospect table. So it's a really pragmatic tip, and it's free of charge, isn't it?
It is.
You definitely want to develop some sort of process to keep everybody up to date. In most organizations that Amsterdam work with, we are doing a monthly, what we call market outlook event, and it lasts for half an hour. Everybody has half an hour per month. And that doesn't just give information, but it also engages the team on business development. And finally, you want to make sure you have the time, the capacity, and frankly, the willingness to invest in 1 or 2 submissions of more of your prioritized donors about that per month. If you keep that level up, you will be successful in securing more funding. It is simple as that. Actually, it's easier said than done, because it takes a lot of time and energy, but if you do it well, the experience of the last 15 years has shown that this works. Half an hour I said I would talk, and it's now 15:30. I'm pretty proud of myself. Jules, you just want to briefly tell everybody about the upcoming webinars?
Yeah, we have 2 exciting webinars coming up. The next one's on the 24th of May. It's about writing better proposals to secure better funding, which is always interesting and great to get good tips. And then on the 14th of June, so a few weeks after that, when we are well into summer, we will be hosting a webinar on getting your funding strategy right.
Cool. Okay, so interesting enough, the June webinar then is the one that leads and ends at donor map. So you heard me say about the funding strategy at the beginning of this slide deck. That's where the funding strategy is obviously an essential part to be done internally. Great. I'm pretty much on time, right?
You're perfectly on time. We do have a few questions coming through.
Okay, let's do this. I'll share.
So Shakib Nabi has been very active on the questions. So I'm just going to read one or two of his questions. His first comment and question was, I agree with you that Germany is becoming a bigger donor, but I see that there are competitions are increasing drastically. The reason being more and more non-German NGOs are registering themselves in Germany to attract resources. What should the way forward be then?
No, you're right. So the background is really interesting, and I'm obviously biased here because I am German. I work a lot with the German donor agencies. So the one thing that nobody asks is Germany doesn't have one donor agency. Bear that in mind. We have about 4. Trust us to make it complicated. But that is just a fact. And most organizations know about BMZ and GIZ, and they are going for it. Lots of UK and US organizations are targeting German funding. And it's the same thing that happened at the beginning of the 90s in the UK, where lots of European went to the UK and lots of Americans went to the UK as funding was up there. The best way of tackling that is thematic engagement, particularly with the BMZ and the GIZ, but also with the KfW and the wider donor and NGO society around here. These donors are overwhelmed. They're getting more and more funding from the federal and from the states funding here in Germany, and with a need and a mandate and a legal requirement to push that out. And they do not develop programs in isolation. They are looking for innovation. They're looking to engage and thematically engage with you, the experts on whatever it is you're working on. Good engagement triggers almost, maximizes your chance for being shortlisted, which maximizes your chance for getting the funding. It's also really essential for your donor mapping. So back to the topic, because the more you engage with the donor pre-bid, the better you get an impression of what a bid when working with them would be like, which may change your prioritization of what donors you would like to have. So in answer to your question, make sure that you thematically engage with the donors on your chosen areas of expertise, then not just monitor, but also prioritize each funding opportunity in your prospect table, and then only go for those that you really want to.
Thank you, Chris, for that fantastic answer. We have an anonymous attendee asking a question on moving from a good donor map to action. When working in a sector where most funders do not accept unsolicited applications and do not have open application processes, what is the best actionable insights we can provide colleagues? LinkedIn pages, current contacts who used to work there or are current grantees, conferences their team are attending, etc. Excuse my reading there.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'd love to know what the question is aiming at, frankly. So when you to move a donor map into action should come with a date. There's only 2 types of prospects that you would map out on a donor map. One is the unspecific one, which is pre-release, which means we know that some funding is coming, but we don't know what form it is, how much funding it is, or when the call is going to be made. And the other one is specific, where we have a specific requirement saying, hey, by the 30th of May, we need to hand in a 17-page proposal or a 100-page proposal with a project design, a budget and everything for this or that project. Moving it to action then requires setting those dates and getting the program team to design the program, the finance team to write a budget, and the proposal to be quality checked a few days before submission is due and then authorized. So that's a fairly straightforward thing. On the unsolicited ones, that Google Alert will help you, making sure that you don't miss it when an identified opportunity becomes live, becomes a submittable application. And bear in mind that most restricted funding opportunities now give less than 45 days notice between call proposals and the due date for the proposal. You might want to move your colleagues to build alliances and consortia even before the call proposal is out. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Chris. We have another question from Francis. What are the examples of innovative donors that are looking for unrestricted funding?
So I assume that this call asks for which donors provide unrestricted funding. Over half of the most Central European humanitarian funding is unrestricted. So that's a massive chunk. There's a ton of foundations that do not restrict funding out of principle now. The debate is moving towards it. Obviously, by its nature, most corporate funding, which is big in the US and in, again, Germany, is unrestricted if you negotiate it right. And finally, there are growing unrestricted elements with those donors you wouldn't expect it from, particularly KfW in Germany, or certain foundations in the US as well, because they are starting to realize that a restrictive funding policy actually deteriorates their NGO base. This race to the bottom. So there's a ton of organizations that provide unrestricted funding. The trick is, again, to invest the time and the money to do a proper donor map. So if you need a lot of unrestricted funding, then that donor map needs to set that as a parameter and ignore all others.
Great, thank you, Chris. We have a simpler question here from Willow, and I hope we can answer it. What program was used to build the donor database?
So any table management tool will work, whether it's Google Sheet, Microsoft Excel, or Airtable. There's a ton of them. Don't spend money on it. Airtable is useful for large international team. A simple Google Sheet, like the one I showed you in that slide, with the simple table will also do.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. Just a question from Amanullah Nori. What are the most important factors to map funding for new NGOs while they have no experience?
We get that question a lot. NGOs that don't have a track record obviously have a challenge. But bear in mind that for almost all large donors, there are sections of their funding specifically designed for small new organizations. So if you're a new organization, you will not aim at this 1.5 million, 2 million euro ECHO grant or EU grant or FCDO one, but you'll probably go below the de minimis level. That requires also easier administration. I think it changes every year. I think for this year it's about 280 or 300,000 euros maximum. Below that, where the donor doesn't need to go out for public bids. So again, you want to engage with the donor, provide them your solution, and be open about the fact that it is a new organization. You might want to use the track record of your staff rather than of the organization, and obviously be heavy on the innovation. As a small new team, you probably have an innovative new idea that you can pitch. And then bear in mind that innovation-based funding is also available to all kinds of organizations, including those without a track record. So this will be the challenge funds or the research funds or in the innovation funds of the US, of the EU. And they're actually called innovation funds. So you can Google that.
Great, thank you, Chris. Anna has just sent through a question and a comment. On the topic of German donors, would there be any advice on how to deal with the GIZ grant or tender database? She finds it horrible to find anything there. Do they have many grant calls there?
Oh, Diana, I'm so sorry. You're so right. The same could be said about the EU database. The website is difficult. And I understand, and we work a lot with GIZ and the EU. I understand. I don't want to shame them for it. There's a lot of procurement regulations that make a call proposal and therefore the website extremely complex. For example, in the EU, most calls proposals need to be advertised in at least 2 or 3 languages, SAM.gov or work with USAID.gov or United Nations Business Center is also quite difficult to manage and navigate. This is not a simple tool. I completely agree with you. There's 2 ways of doing it. Either get through it, so dedicate. I think that's probably accounts for the for a large part of the time required to scan for information and for scan for opportunities. So we said about 50 hours per country per month. Or outsource it. That's also a very good way of doing it. And I'm a little bit biased. Amsterdam does opportunity mapping for many NGO partners because we specialize on that. And because we specialize, we can concentrate on doing that whilst you have a lot of other things to do. But if you get a consultant or a dedicated member of staff or us tasked with looking for funding, then we probably find more because it takes a lot of time. There is no other way to make this easier. There are database websites like DevX, like Funds for NGO, Triple Funds, that make this a little bit easier. But after the second link, they also refer just back to the website because they're crawling that information portal and they're assembling it into a easier to read format. It doesn't actually reduce the work. So find someone internally or outsource it.
Great, thank you, Chris. Shakib has sent us another question, and I think it is quite relevant and interesting to answer. What do we think are the key steps in building relationships with donors where the organization is new? So it's...
Yeah, again, it's the same as with an established organization, actually. It's that thematic engagement. So in the business development that we do with our NGO partners, we don't just identify live opportunities ready to bid. We actually identify opportunities to engage with thematically. So whatever you work on, humanitarian, development, WASH, advocacy, rights-based, environmental, cultural, whatever, engage with the donor on a thought leadership level, on a thematic area. You will get to know the donors via the various events every year. My colleague can tell you about those. The working groups that are happening every week in Brussels, in Berlin, in Washington, in London, the committees, as well as the other sort of civil and NGO fora around the world. So engaging with them thematically, whether you're an established organization or whether you are completely new, is a key building block of business development. And frankly, we don't do it enough.
Thank you, Chris. Paulina has just asked advice on how to engage with private foundations. The majority does its own research and approach directly to the organizations. How can you make your organizational visible in their map?
I worked with an environmental organization earlier today where we had exactly that question. We want to engage with a private foundation who does their own research. What we ended up with this afternoon is engaging with them thematically. We are basically contributing to their and criticizing their research. We're understanding their research, and then we are commenting on it, either directly and or publicly. And that engagement is driving a conversation. That engagement hopefully gets us to more innovative project design as well. So again, there is no magic bullet here. We have to take the time to be part of the discussion. And if the private foundation or the donor does a piece of research that is relevant in your area, you might want to engage with it.
Great, thank you. Just some of the comments on our chat. Do we have some tips for fundraising opportunities for a smaller UN organization?
Yeah, exactly the same. UN organizations are no different to any other organization in that respect. Does that help? I'm not trying to be flippant here, but why would it be different?
Okay, great. Chris, I think we've gotten through most of the questions today. Well, one more has just popped through. Should we
let's do one more and then we call it a day.
Jonathan has just written, you mentioned working groups as a good way to engage with potential donors on a thematic basis. Any advice on how we can find and join these groups?
Through donor mapping. So a good donor map will also identify engagement opportunities. That's why I kind of said initially opportunities and engagement. Jonathan, the underlying assumption here being is that let me say it this way. If we only start talking to the donor when they have a live opportunity online, then that's probably too late. That's, it's a bit like we're only actually interested in talking to you once you got the money. For every program that every donor does, there's working groups engagement. If you look at the events page of GIZ, there's plenty of events right now that are publicly available. You can contact them, be on their email roster. You can do your own events and invite them to it. You can participate in the weekly thematic working groups in Brussels, in Washington. You have a right as a European citizen or the US citizen to attend those and at least listen in. That is your civic right. For most of them at least, and engage with them. And it is, if you are in Brussels or if you struggle to identify them, then please reach out and we'll see what you do and which working groups and which conferences and which discussion boards would be the ones for you to engage on. There are plenty of those. Donors do not come up with programs out of isolation. They engage quite actively. And we need to be part of that engagement. Good. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. I think we've had a lot of insights throughout this webinar. Lots of questions have come through. If you have any more questions, please do feel free to email us at hello@mzninternational.com. Thank you to Chris for giving us your expert insight and such an extensive look into how to get donor mapping right.
Thank you very much.
It's not an easy process, but if you take the steps in the webinar that we've discussed, you can get there.
Perfect. Jules, thank you so much. And if there are any questions that we didn't answer, please reach out, as Jules said, and I wish you all a wonderful day and please do stay healthy. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.